Well, it is championship week in college football, and the Big D is ready with a championship week theme episode. Before I bring in David Moulton, please subscribe, like, and share the Spunky Spectrum Sports YouTube page. The weather's getting a little cool outside here in Florida, so I'm thankful for that. Also, check out the Big D podcast for the audio listeners, Spotify and Apple. So, ready to talk things college football before he heads off to Atlanta and Jacksonville. Host a radio show, Gary Danielson's and Troy Aikman's spotter for CBS and ESPN Monday Night Football, respectively. David Moulton joining us. So, David, Have you already booked your plane ticket to Atlanta?
Oh yeah, it's a day trip for me. Been doing it. Lucky now. This is my 18th and final one with CBS, and so it's been a huge game just about every year. It is probably the championship game that most are interested in terms of the outcome could most dramatically impact who's in the playoff. That and Florida State. I mean, if Florida State wins, I think they're in. They lose, then a spot's clearly open.
What's been the best SEC championship game or moment you can remember?
Oh wow, I'm going to start to go down memory lane here. So our very first championship game that I did with Gary was 2006. And that was the Saturday that Michigan had just lost to Ohio State the week before. People were pounding the table for a rematch. Then USC walloped Notre Dame, and the thought was, okay, USC is going to play Ohio State. And 18 years ago, the SEC was not a national conference. The SEC was still looked down upon. And ESPN, Dylan, had put on their website leading into championship weekend who should play Ohio State for the national title. And they only listed Michigan and USC. They didn't even list Florida, who was ranked fourth in the country and was 11-1. Didn't even list them. And by like late Tuesday afternoon, Wednesday, they begrudgingly put Florida on the website. But the powers that be, the influence makers in the sport, did not want Florida playing Ohio State. They did not think the SEC champion was worthy. And at halftime of that 2006 SEC title game, UCLA had upset USC. And so now Florida is very much in play. Now it's if Florida can beat Arkansas, should Florida play Ohio State or should there be Ohio State Michigan rematch? And Florida ends up blowing a halftime lead and they fall behind late third quarter. They rally to win. We all know what happened. Florida got in the game against the huge protests of Kirk Herbstreit, Chris Fowler, and somebody, and was it Desmond? Yeah, Desmond, pounding the table. Literally, Kirk Herbstreit pounded the desk before the vote was tabulated that Michigan should get a rematch and Florida shouldn't. And so that was very dramatic. We knew the second half of that game, the whole country was watching us, so to speak, because they were watching Florida. And now Florida was going to get their 2 hours to showcase whether or not they and the SEC deserved being put in the title game. And so, the next year, LSU was ranked 7th in the country. All hell broke loose that day. LSU dramatically gets a pick six late to win it with a backup quarterback. LSU ends up playing for the national title and winning. 008, Tebow with the literally perfect fourth quarter passing leads them from behind to beat Nick in Alabama, the only SEC title game Nick's lost. The dramatic Georgia-Alabama game of 2012 when George is driving and Murray looks right where his receiver's double covered. If he looks left, he's got a guy wide open in the end zone for the game-winning touchdown. He throws it right. Alabama wins and goes on to beat Notre Dame for the title. Tyrann Mathieu with the punt return in 2011 for the score, or 2011. Yeah, I think it was 2011. You name it. Joe Burrow's masterpiece. Alabama 2 years ago, this exact spot, D. Georgia's 12-0, Bama's 11-1. Bama escapes Auburn dramatically. Remember that game? Bryce Young goes 97 yards in a minute with no timeouts. They force 4 overtimes. They win. They were lucky to be 11-1, right? And then they drilled Georgia. Just flat embarrassed them. They whooped them so badly when nobody thought they were going to win. Georgia was undefeated, number 1 in the country. And here we are 2 years later. It's the exact same scenario. So, been very lucky, D. It's been a great game. It's been an amazing conference. And now not only are they national, they are the conference that everyone is held up against.
Well, for CBS's final SC title game, it would only make sense that Alabama and Georgia are reacquainting themselves.
And Georgia's never beaten Bama in this spot. You know, Kirby beat them for a national title, but in 2012, the game that we referenced, Aaron Murray, 29-24, Alabama. Let's see, 2018, Georgia's got a 2-touchdown lead in the third quarter. If they beat Bama, they'll get in the playoff. And Tua is benched for Hurts.
Actually, Tua was hurt in that game.
He gets hurt. He eventually then gets taken out. Jalen Hurts comes off the bench in the same stadium where a year earlier, Tua comes off the bench to throw the 2nd and 26 national championship winning throw. 11 months later, Jalen Hurts comes off the bench, rallies Alabama to 3 touchdowns and a 35-28 win. So Georgia lost in 12, they lost in 18, and they lost again in 21. So this is 4th time in 12 years for Georgia against Bama. It's the 3rd time for Kirby against Nick for the SEC title. Is the 3rd time the charm.
Well, speaking of Nick Saban, be honest with you, I mean, with how Jaden Milroe improved that pass on 4th and a mile last week, is this Nick Saban's best coaching job or one of his best coaching jobs?
It is. And this is the one of the big misnomers about Nick. If you watch, and I hope that Nick coaches for another 5, 7, 8 years, you know, once you get into your 70s, you know, who knows how long a guy's going to coach. But Nick, when his team is losing, is not the screamer and yeller that he's made out to be. Nick is very positive when things are going badly. He's constantly clapping his hands. He's constantly encouraging guys. Nick is a blankety blank when they're winning. He wants them to not relax. He wants them to stay on edge. That's when Nick, I mean, the famous cutaways we've had over the years, when Nick was screaming and yelling at Lane Kiffin when he was his offensive coordinator the one game, they're up 3 touchdowns in the 4th quarter when that, you know, shot was taken. I mean, and so when Jalen Milroe and this team was struggling earlier in the year, Nick was very positive. Nick was, it's going to be okay. We just got to get better every week. They did realize, first off, Milroe had to be the guy. Secondly, they weren't working his running aspect into their offense. And it was the Tennessee game in which they kind of unleashed Milroe and said, hey, you don't have to be a pocket passer. And in fact, we're actually going to call some running plays and not RPO plays. We're talking about fake a misdirection here, and you're going to be the primary runner, and you're going to go here. And once they did that, it just seemed as if it started to come together. He's got a very strong arm. It's not always accurate. That's okay. And he's clearly a leader. The guys love him. Love him. That, by the way, is what happened in the South Florida game. When Nick benched Milroe and Alabama's a 5-touchdown favorite didn't show up, that's when Nick realized, oh, wow, I'm about to lose the locker room. If I don't put Milroe back in, I'm going to lose this team. And, you know, the guys will let the coaches know sometimes who should be playing. And the guys let Nick know against South Florida, get Milroe back in here. And then every week, they just, you know, they got very good coaching staff. And yes, I think it's one of Nick. And not only that, Dylan, Nick liked this team. He did a post-game interview with Jenny Dell in which mid-season he was laughing and joking. And she almost asked him, like, why? He goes, I really like coaching this group. They're a fun group. He goes, they drive me a little crazy, but this is a good group of guys to be around. He likes this team. And after a little early season adversity, they like him too.
And plus, I mean, Alabama, if Georgia, I mean, Alabama and or Georgia always seem to end up in Atlanta either the opening Saturday night of the season or the first Saturday in December. So Alabama will be just fine at the Benz.
Well, there's no doubt. And if the way tickets are dispersed, there's still a large contingent of tickets that go through Birmingham, which is where the SEC is headquartered. Well, who dominates Birmingham?
Alabama.
Alabama. Alabama is always very well represented at what was first, the Georgia Dome and now Mercedes-Benz. Very well represented. That place, it's funny. It's the SEC championship game, which oftentimes is a half and half crowd, always has a much better atmosphere than the Florida-Georgia game, which also has a half and half crowd. I don't know if it's because it's indoors. I don't know if because there's more at stake. I don't know. But the atmosphere is always raucous the first Saturday in December in Atlanta. Always.
And for Georgia, obviously Georgia's going for a historic three-peat, different quarterback, Carson Beck now. I feel like, I don't know if it's to me, but I feel like Carson Beck can actually play in the NFL.
Oh, there's no doubt Carson Beck can play in the NFL. Now, here's the thing about this, though. Dylan, 2 years ago when Georgia was going into that SEC title game, the thought was, well, if Georgia loses, they're still in. And sure enough, Georgia got whacked, and Georgia was still comfortably in the playoffs. Dylan, that's the big difference between this time around. Georgia loses, they could easily be out, especially if form holds everywhere else. Michigan goes, Florida State goes. The thought is that the Pac-12 champion's going to go because it's number 3 against number 5. So now there's only one spot left. And the thought is, well, Bama would go over Georgia, or does Texas go over Alabama, which would go over Georgia? So that's the big difference now between 2 years ago. It's not three-peat. It's we got to win to make sure we're in.
Yeah, it feels like. Is there a possibility that Alabama wins, but the committee selects Michigan, the Pac-12 champ, Florida State, and Texas?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. Most national people do not think so. Most national people think there's no way you can have a college football playoff without the SEC champion in it because there's just too much talent in the conference. I mean, take a look at the first round of the draft every year. It's 12 to 16 guys are out of the SEC. And look at the talent that Georgia's accumulated over the last handful of years. Dylan, they haven't lost a regular season game since the cocktail party in 2020. They've lost one game since. Are we really going to keep them out? Are we going to keep the SEC champion, which is named, let's just say it's 12-1 Alabama? Now, Dylan, I would take Texas over Bama. They beat them head-to-head. To me, that's always first tiebreaker. That's not first tiebreaker in the College Football Playoff Committee's list of tiebreakers. It's like number 4. And most national people, D, think that if Bama wins, they'll be in. Don't know about Georgia. Don't know about Texas. All right. But Bama will get in. And then they'll figure the rest out.
It's funny how this game's reversed because you think Georgia would run the ball. I think Georgia's going to try and throw the ball because we're back. I mean, of course, Brock Bowers. Who's that? Great
McConkey.
McConkey. I think Georgia's going to try and throw the ball in Bama.
Well, Georgia throws half the time. Half of their passes are on first down. Georgia actually throws to run. In that way, even though they're not running the same offense, they're a lot like Bill Walsh and the Niners back in the day with Montana. Everybody thought that San Francisco threw it all over the lot. They actually ran the ball over 50% of the time. They just didn't do it on first down. they threw the ball on first down, and then it set up second and short, and then that's when they ran, etc. Georgia likes to throw on early downs. To me, what will be interesting in this game, D, is can Georgia just line up and run the ball on Alabama? Because I'm not sure they can. So will Georgia have to throw the ball? It's been very few times in the last 3 years, D, that a team has made Georgia's offense one-dimensional. That's the first thing I would look for in this game. Can Georgia line up and just run the ball against Alabama? The only teams, D, this year that have run the ball against Alabama have been able to do so with a running quarterback.
Texas?
Well, Ewers is not a really, I mean, he's got mobility and what have you, but also week 2 versus now. But if you look like LSU with Daniels, all right, even Joe Milton to some extent. But when they stopped running Joe Milton, do you know what Tennessee couldn't do? Tennessee, who runs 250 yards a game. Do you know how many yards they ran for against Alabama? 54. Okay, after halftime. They couldn't run. And that's the thing. Georgia does not have a running quarterback. So can they just line up and run the ball? I'm not sure that they can. So then does that mean Georgia has to throw the ball to win? Well, Alabama's got 2 really good corners who I think can cover Georgia's top 2 wide receivers. So to me, the game could be Brock Bowers. This could be a 10, 12 catch game for Brock Bowers, and it may have to be for Georgia if Bama can take the tailback away, which very few teams have done. But by the same token, I'm not sure Alabama can move the ball consistently against Georgia unless it's Milroe running all over the place.
Yeah, because Alabama doesn't have that great wide receiver. There's no Julio Jones. There's no Devontae Smith.
No, they got one guy who I think, is pretty good. But, I also don't think they have a dominant tailback. So how is Bama going to move the ball? I think the one thing Georgia hasn't faced a lot of in the last 3 years is a quarterback who can really run. It'll be interesting. Does Georgia, like I just did the Monday Night Football Bears Vikings, Brian Flores, the Vikings defensive coordinator, how did he handle Justin Fields? Well, he kept alternating. He either was going after him hard with 6 or 7 guys, or he was only rushing 3. And that, to me, will be the chess match when Alabama has the ball. Is Georgia going to attack Milroe and hope to get him before he runs all over the lot? Or are they going to lay back and say, we don't think you can beat us throwing the ball, dude. And if you try to run, we'll close these gaps real quickly with 8 guys. So it's a fascinating chess match if both teams play the way that they have so far this year. It's not often Alabama's a near touchdown underdog. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, especially because Alabama's lost and won every SEC championship but one since what, the 90s?
Well, they lost in 08 to Tebow and the Gators, the year they won their second title. But then, let's see, they won in 09, they won in 12, they won 14, 15, 16. That's 5.
18.
They won 18, and they won 20.
And
they won 21. So that's 8, right? That's 8 SEC championships for Alabama. 3 of those at Georgia's expense, by the way.
I'm sure Kirby Smart's annoyed at that.
He's been on both sides of it. He was the D coordinator in 12 when they won, and he's been the head coach in 18 and 21 when they lost.
It's going to be I think it's going to be a low scoring game. It might be more like a true SEC game. It might be one of those 23-20
Yes. I agree with you. I would think if a team could get to 27, 28, I think they would win. I think even 24 could be the magic number. I agree with you. Listen, but the other one, though, is the ACC title game. And I know Louisville lost last week to Kentucky, but, Florida State's only a 2.5-point favorite because they're out there with their backup quarterback. And all the pressure's on the Noles, and Louisville's playing with the proverbial house money, so to speak. They're playing for a title, and they're not going to be in the playoff if they win. And Braum can coach. Remember, he led Purdue to the Big Ten title game last year. I mean, so Braum and his staff this isn't going to be too big of an occasion for them. And Louisville, after losing to Kentucky last week, they feel like they have to win this game to salvage really their season, which sounds silly with them being 10-2, but they didn't play Florida State, Clemson, or North Carolina this year. I mean, that's a record based largely on schedule. So Louisville's playing kind of angry at themselves because they blew their arch rival game last week. That to me is a fascinating game with a very low point spread, and Florida State clearly has to win to make the playoff.
I think the question is, what Jack Plum are we going to get? Because if Louisville doesn't turn it over, I think the Coners have got a chance. But if Jack Plummer turns it over, Louisville's not being after with 3 turnovers.
And Louisville's got to block Florida State up front. And Florida State
That's the problem.
Yeah, it is. Florida State, there are certain areas of Florida State in which you go, ooh, they look like Florida State again. And one of them is their ability to rush the passer off the edge. And the other is their big play wide receivers. I mean, that's when you go, this looks like the Florida State teams I've seen when they've been championship caliber. And that's why when they had the quarterback, they were a very live play. I mean, now they're not going to have a huge run in the playoff. Now it's just a matter of can they get to the playoff.
Do you think the committee would ever leave out a 13-0 Power 5 team?
I don't. I do think, though, that if Bama upsets Georgia, it makes it a very messy situation for the committee. I mean, are we going to leave out the 2-time defending national champion who hasn't lost a regular season game in 3 years? Are we going to leave out the SEC entirely? And if the answer is no, well, then you got to put Bama in, right? Because they won the title game. So
we're going to leave out Texas.
But once again, phrase the question the way you want in the order that you want. I asked the question, are we going to leave out the 12-1 SEC champion? Yes or no? If you, as a group, decide no, well, then you're putting Bama in. They're in. You worry about the dominoes after that, but you put Bama in. Okay, now at the expense of who? Dylan, it's difficult to see unless both Florida State and Texas lose. It's difficult to see how both Bama and Georgia could get in. If that were to happen, then it would probably come down to Georgia at 12-1, possibly Washington at 12-1 if they lose, and Ohio State at 11-1. I think Georgia would win that competition for the 4th spot. But think about what would have to happen. Bama has to pull the upset, Florida State has to get upset, and Texas has to get upset. So the odds are if Georgia loses, they're out.
Yeah, and this isn't like 2021 when Georgia's got a big non-conference win.
Right, and there wasn't as much of a formidable competition. If you look back, this would be an unbelievable year for a 6 or an 8 team playoff. Most years, Dylan, we've had trouble finding a 4th team. And this year, we feel like, we could have 6 easy. Hell, we might even be able to have 8. So this is a different year.
Yeah. And you know what's not different? Michigan playing its 3rd straight Big Ten title game against Iowa. Iowa, come on, man! Iowa beating Nebraska 13-10 and frustrating all of us, right?
Well, some of the prop bets on this game are hysterical. Over under half a point for Iowa in each half. I mean, that's up on the board. I would love to see if there's a prop bet for number of punts. If you figure there's going to be 10 or 11 possessions in this game, number of punts for Iowa, I'd put it 6.5 over under. I mean, the one thing I will just throw out there, how interesting would it be if they didn't rule that a fair catch for Iowa against Minnesota? Because remember, everybody on the field played that play as if it was a live play. And Iowa returned that punt for a touchdown, which would have given them the lead with a few minutes to go, and they likely hold on and win the game, which means Iowa would be 11-1. And now where would Iowa be ranked? Well, they'd probably be the worst ranked one-loss team, but they'd be ninth. And then you start to make the argument, well, if they were ranked ninth and they pull the upset, would they be in play to get in the playoff, because the Big Ten has to have a representative, right?
Yeah.
And if they beat Michigan, but Ohio State didn't, or do you put Michigan in anyway? I mean, that I would love, even though Iowa's a 23-point dog, I do think it would be spectacular if, in retrospect, they hadn't ruled that a fair catch and Iowa would have gotten credit for the punt return touchdown. They'd be 11-1, arguably the ugliest 11-1 we've ever seen from a Power 5 school. Yet those of us of a certain age remember that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 1999, with Sean King at quarterback and one of the worst offenses that the NFL has ever seen, had a 6-5 fourth quarter lead on the greatest show on turf in the NFC Championship game. And I think some of us would be watching this Big Ten title game going, this is either going to be 38-0 or this is going to be 11-6. And I'm just not sure which.
It could be like Iowa Michigan State 2015 was 41-7-6 on what the last play of the game.
Well, I don't know if it was 7-6, but they did have that epic, 90-something yard, 11-minute drive in which they, scored at the very end. I thought both teams have scored a little bit. I thought it was like 21-20 or, something like that. I don't think it was 7-6. What was it?
16-13.
Okay. So, but in retrospect now, I wish they hadn't called the fair catch just to see if Iowa was still in play. But that's another thing. If the unthinkable happens, Michigan loses, are they in? Let's just say that's the only upset, by the way. So Georgia wins, whoever wins the Pac-12 title game, Florida State wins. Michigan loses as a 23-point favorite to Iowa.
Goodbye.
Okay, but then the Big Ten gets nobody? You're going to put Texas in? Texas is the fourth and the Big Ten's out? See, that's the argument about Georgia, Alabama. If you're saying Texas goes ahead of Alabama, and by the way, I'm one of those guys. To me, head-to-head is always the first tiebreaker. They'll take in schedule and straight the conference and what have you. To me, it would always be first tiebreaker, Texas. But that's the argument that is. So the funny thing is, the thought is, Georgia's not in. They have to win. But is Michigan in? Like, if they lose, are they out? Are we going to keep the Big Ten out?
That would be unthinkable, right?
Well, it's unthinkable to keep the SEC out, right? Now, the Big Ten's been kept out before. The SEC hasn't been kept. This is the 10th year of 4. The SEC ain't never been kept out before. Hell, they've had like 2 representatives 2-3 times. Although the Big Ten had 2 last year, remember?
Yeah. Do you between Michigan and Georgia, who do you think's number one?
Oh, if Georgia wins, they're number one.
No, I mean in your personal opinion, because you've seen both teams play. Like, do you think Michigan could actually play Georgia heads up?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Michigan would match up very well with Georgia. Michigan's offensive line is outstanding, and it's 7-8 deep, which it's needed to be because they've gotten 2 starters hurt in their last 2 games. And Michigan's front 6-7 is every bit as worthy as Georgia's. And to me, the way to attack Michigan is to go after their secondary. Well, I don't know if Georgia could do it. Put it this way. If Carson Beck was on Ohio State, I think Ohio State would have beat Michigan. But Ohio State's receivers are not on Georgia. So it's a fascinating, they've got Brock Bowers at probably not 100%, but no, the Michigan-Georgia game would be spectacular in its old school phone booth, Green Bay Packers of Lombardi era ways. I mean, honestly, it would just be a physical. It would be Giants Niners NFC Championship game of 1990. Is so how physical and how epic that game could be. But D, here's the fact. Let's just say the teams win who are expected to win. Michigan could face Oregon in the semis.
Oof,
That's
that's good.
not a team, right? Nobody wants to face Georgia. They're a little different than everybody else, and they're a lot more physical than the Pac 12 teams normally are. So, that's the wild card here. If the favorites all win, we're likely going to have Georgia, Michigan, Oregon, Florida State ranked in that order.
So we get an old school Rose Bowl and an old school Sugar Bowl.
Right. Okay. Although a year or so from now, that could end up being 2 SEC and 2 Big Ten teams.
Well, speaking of that Pac-12 championship game, and probably one of the best championship quarterback matchups we've seen, Bo Nix in Oregon will take on Michael Penix in Washington, and after the crazy game they had in Seattle, I don't know what to expect. I mean, Oregon's what, a 9.5 point
Well,
favorite, and to be honest,
yes. I mean,
I think I think Oregon can match up with Michigan and Georgia. They're that physical, and Bo Nix. Eventually, Bo Nix is going to win a big game, right?
yes. And I will say, I think there's a couple times that he's been on the short end that it hasn't necessarily been his fault. I thought Dan Lanning cost his team the game the first time they played. I really did. Not going for the field goal at the end of the first half. The fourth down decision late in the game at midfield. I didn't like the major decisions Dan Lanning made in that game. I thought it cost Oregon dearly. The thought now is neutral field as opposed to being on the road. Oregon had the edge in play first time. That Oregon will get them this time. There's whispers out there, D, that Penix is hurt. He hasn't been as good the last 2-3 weeks, and there are people that believe we think something's going on here. He's not the same guy. So, yeah, I mean, think about it: 9.5 point dog. You're 12-0. You've beaten the teams that you've beaten if you're Washington, and you're basically a 10-point dog in the championship game. I mean, I don't know what's more a sign of disrespect this week: the Eagles being an underdog at home against the Niners, or Washington's 10-point dogness against Oregon.
And it's not like Washington's short of receivers with Remy Odunze, who made maybe the play of the year on
Right.
that fourth down last week.
Yeah. I will say I wonder if Washington's D can hold up. Oregon scored 33 against them the first time and moved the ball up and down the field. And I watched Oregon State, even though Washington beat them. I watched Oregon State for a half just physically manhandle Washington's front. So I'll be curious if Washington physically can hold up in this game.
Plus, since that Oregon game, I feel like Washington's won all these close games. I mean, USC, Oregon State, Utah.
Yeah, but I actually think that's a good thing. I actually think that then if it's another close game that they'll be like, this is what we do. Whereas Oregon, and that was Florida, by the way, going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation in 2006. That was the Ohio State Buckeyes of 2002. Yeah, they were in all these close games. Yeah, they won them all. I mean, isn't that the name of the game? Who cares that they were close games? I mean, the Gators were in one ugly game after another, seemingly in 2006. Yeah, they won all but one of them. I mean,
Florida needed 2 Jarvis Moss block kicks against South Carolina.
Right. That's 2 weeks earlier. Exactly. So, but then again, Ohio State 20 years ago needed Holy Buckeye to beat Purdue. So, Ohio State that year, Cincinnati 20 years ago, not, the Cincinnati team from a few years ago that was in the playoffs. Cincinnati 20 years ago at Riverfront Stadium had the ball first and goal, where if they scored, they beat the Buckeyes in the final 2 minutes. I mean, it was that type of year for Ohio State. They played like 5-6 of those games. Washington's had that kind of a year too.
Does the winner of this game between Nix and Penix win the Heisman, or is it Jaden Daniels' Heisman to lose?
No, I actually think it's Bo Nix's Heisman to lose. I think that Bo Nix right now would win the vote if they voted today. And so if Nix plays a good game and they win, he'll lead them to a championship and in all likelihood a playoff bid. I think that would win out over the LSU quarterback, even though I don't know that anybody has been a better player this year than Daniels at LSU. And my question is, how come he's not being talked about from a draft status point of view the way other quarterbacks in this class are? He's not 5'11", he's 6'4". He may be a touch skinnier than the guy at USC or even the thickness of Bo Nix, or Drake May seems to look physically more imposing than Daniels. His frame can handle another 10, 12, 15 pounds. He obviously can run around. Have you seen him throw the ball? I mean, I got to be honest. There are teams who are now winning games in the NFL who look as if they're not going to have a first, second, or third overall pick. They're going to be somewhere around 5, 7, 8. I can't pass up Daniels. I'm telling you that right now. Like if I'm Washington, if I'm the Giants, I mean, there's no way I'd pass up Daniels. Well, I don't know. I mean, Atlanta right now is winning the division. They wouldn't draft for a while. But I don't think Daniels, for whatever reason, is getting enough NFL regard. People seem to only view him as a college quarterback. I think that's a mistake.
Well, it'd be funny if the 3 Heisman finalists were all transfers, because Bo Nix went Auburn, Jane Daniels from the State, and then Penix, Indiana.
D, we're going to have to get used to that. And that's just, I mean, that's the lay of the land now. It is what it is.
I mean, NIL transfer portal, it's going to happen, right? It's
already happened. I mean, look at Florida State. Florida State's in the position that they're in because of the portal. I mean, Mike Norvell went 3-6 and 5-7 his first 2 years. Now, yes, he has brought in 2 very good high school classes the last 2 years. That is not why they've won. Let's see, how many in a row have they won now? 18 in a row? I mean, that's not the reason. I mean, those pass rushing defensive ends, those wide receivers, that quarterback. I mean, the majority of those players all came from elsewhere. I mean, Florida State has crushed the portal. And that's the big difference between Florida State and Florida right now, D. I mean, Billy Napier's gone 6-7 and 5-7. Well, Norvell just went 3-6 and 5-7. What was the difference? Florida State already had their quarterback on campus. We're not sure that Florida has their quarterback of the future on campus, although he may be arriving, the 5-star kid, Rashada. But also, Napier's doing a good job recruiting the high school class, not doing a great job with the portal. He's brought in like a couple of guys from Louisiana and his quarterback and his wide receiver. Well, the wide receiver's leaving. The quarterback could leave. And the Louisiana guy's eligibility is up also.
Florida needs about 10 offensive linemen.
Florida needs 24 guys. They really do. They need to crush the portal, and they need to do it quickly, because Napier's schedule next year is probably the toughest in the country. 8 SEC games, no Vandy, by the way. And, Miami, Florida State, and UCF. 11 Power 5 opponents on his schedule next year. Probably the toughest in the country.
Including a road trip to Texas, if my memory serves me right.
Yeah. Also, by the way, Michigan, which is a reason why a lot of people think Harbaugh will be leaving. Not only will he lose 30 terrific players, but Michigan's cake schedule this year is replaced by USC, Oregon, Washington, Ohio State, and a road game against Texas next year. Right. A little different schedule for Michigan next year.
Speaking of Texas, how about the Longhorns and Cowboys and Big D for the Big 12? Every time I see Oklahoma State play, I think, is Ozzie Gordon going to break one of Barry Sanders' rushing records for the Cowboys?
Well, I will say
Ollie Gordon, thank you.
Gundy's done a hell of a job. This team was not picked to do this. It's been a very emotional season for them, and he's played on it well. Dramatic comeback against BYU last week to get in this game. And will a team that's staying in the Big 12 deny Texas, a team who's leaving the Big 12, the final Big 12 title, if you will, with Texas and Oklahoma in it. I don't think they'll be able to. I think that it's not a great matchup for Oklahoma State. And I think Texas is back. I think Texas is going to be left out of the playoff, though. I think Texas is going to be 5 when it's all said and done. But I think Texas is back.
I'll tell you, Texas got some big boys on that D line.
Well, they need it, especially for where they're going.
Yeah, I mean, what Texas did basically running out the last 740 against Alabama showed me something because I've not seen a team do that outside the SEC in forever. And do you think Quinn Hughes is coming back next year?
I don't know. I know Texas would probably want him to move on because they've got 2 5-stars waiting in the wings, and you run the risk of losing them both. The early word was a couple of weeks ago that Ewers was thinking of coming back. I think he's an NFL quarterback. I think there are a lot of NFL quarterbacks that are playing in college right now. I really do. I like the kid at South Carolina a lot.
Spencer Rattler?
Yeah, I like Ewers at Texas. All right. I like Daniels at LSU. I mean, besides the obvious ones that get talked about, I will say Bo Nix at Auburn, not a pro quarterback. Bo Nix first year at Oregon, not a pro quarterback. Bo Nix this year, because listen, Jalen Hurts wasn't a pro quarterback for most of his college career either. Final year at Oklahoma, you went, maybe. And then even still, he continued to get better and better once he got to the pros. You know, I think there are a lot of very intriguing quarterback prospects. And Dylan, goodness knows, there are a lot of teams who need quarterbacks.
I think both teams on Monday night probably need one. This past Monday night, Chicago.
Well, I think Chicago will be moving on from Justin Fields. I do. I think they'll use Carolina's pick and take a quarterback. And whether they trade Fields to someplace like Atlanta or someplace else, but I think that's what they'll do. And I have no idea why Minnesota is seemingly not wanting to sign Kirk Cousins. It makes no sense to me. He's clearly one of the 10 best quarterbacks in the league. I don't know. I would hold on to that guy. I'd be grabbing onto his ankles and crying as he tried to left the building. I really would be.
But maybe Minnesota's thinking is this is the best quarterback draft we will have for a while, and we need one.
Yeah, but they're not in a position to get one. I mean, right now they're in the playoffs, so they're drafting in the high teens, early 20s. You can't count on your quarterback falling to that spot. Never mind the fact that every first-round pick is a flip of the coin anyway. Kirk Cousins is a top 10 quarterback now. I mean, I would keep him. And then if I want to draft somebody at 18, 19 or whatever, and you're like, oh, wow, I really like this guy. Well, then take him. But I don't know why you'd let Kirk Cousins walk out the door. Because here's the other thing. Jefferson's not signing his contract until he knows who the quarterback's going to be. He's already said that out loud. I mean, that's one of the 3 best receivers in the game. Maybe the best. There's a lot riding on this decision for Minnesota.
You don't want Justin Jefferson holdout next year.
Well, or just not wanting to stay, right? I mean, you don't want that at all, obviously.
You know, with NIL, transfer portal, and all these conferences changing, Texas, Oklahoma joining the SEC, Washington, Oregon, USC, and UCLA join the Big Ten, Stanford, Cal join the ACC. Hell, I don't even know who's joining the Big 12 next year. Is the SEC's reign potentially about to end? Could the Big Ten unseat the SEC?
I don't know about unseat it, but maybe they would cozy up and be a close 1A. Whereas really it's been the SEC and everybody else. I think the Big Ten has the chance to cozy up pretty close here. And the problem is then with no one else. I mean, it is going to be Coke and Pepsi and then the rest. Because the other thing, D, that I think is going to happen in the next 6 to 8 months is you're going to see the mass exodus of the ACC. You're going to see what happened to the Pac-12, I believe happened to the ACC, in which 4 to 6 go to the Big Ten, 4 go to the SEC, 4 go to the Big 12, and then the ACC is putting itself back together. Like D, I've been saying on our show for months now, South Florida is going to be in the ACC in 2 years. I mean, it's going to be a dramatically different conference in 2 years. Dramatically different. It wouldn't shock me if it's South Florida, Memphis. I mean, there's schools like that are in the ACC, because I think 8 to 12 schools are leaving here by the spring. They'll announce they're leaving. It'll take them another year to leave, but I think you're going to see the next mass exodus is going to happen to the ACC.
And I would suppose Clemson, Florida State, Miami would join the SEC.
Well, I know Florida State and Clemson would like to join the SEC. Miami, I think, is torn. They could go either way. Remember, they were in the Big East for a long time. And from an academic standpoint, the Big Ten would actually be very interested in them. But, if the breakup happens, you could end up with a 24-team Big 12. I mean, you really could. And don't be surprised if you end up with 20 plus in the SEC and the Big Ten either. But when the ACC breaks up, and I'm pretty confident that it will, do not be surprised if the Big 12 has 24 teams.
Wow.
Well, the NC States, Louisvilles of the world, that's where they're going. The Big Ten and the SEC are not interested in those schools, but the Big 12's already said, oh, yeah, we'd be interested. Think about Louisville joining Cincinnati and West Virginia. Trust me, the Big 12 can really start to take care of some of their schools that feel as if they're on an island here. So, where's Duke going to go? Where's Georgia Tech going to go?
Where's North Carolina going to go?
Well, North Carolina is going to go wherever they want. It's probably the Big Ten. The word is North Carolina and Virginia go to the Big Ten. So, that's to me the next 4 or 5 months from now. You wait to see what happens. I think it'll happen right after the NCAA tournament. It'll go public.
That would be crazy if we're watching the Final Four, then like a week or two later, somebody breaks the story. X team joined the SEC.
Well, I think, Dylan, the whispers will be pretty loud during March Madness.
Yeah. So it's an ever-changing time, not just with players, coaches leaving, but teams leaving conferences.
No doubt about it. Listen, this is capitalism at work here. And I don't know how anybody thought we weren't going to have this. I mean, once the NCAA didn't fix the problems and they let the market fix the problems, well, then the market's all about what? Follow the money. That's what the market is all about in life. We all deal with it every day, whether it's insurance, education, you name it. We all know what it comes down to in the open, free marketplace. Well, how could college athletics, since they didn't take care of it and they were given a 10 to 12-year warning about it, how they couldn't see this coming is laughable. It really is. This is like the tech industry. This would be like Gates and company starting where they were in the late 90s and not seeing the phones and the iPads and they're always years ahead. College sports, decades behind.
All right, David. Safe travels to Atlanta this week,
Short
and then
trip.
Jacksonville for Monday Night Football. I'm sure you're happy for the quick drive down 75 to I-10, right?
Well, since I live in Jacksonville now, it's probably my best travel weekend of the year.
All right. Thanks for hopping on, and we'll see you around.
D, all the best to you and to everybody watching and listening. Happy holidays.